Come on. Let's get started. So, make sure you finish reading the Made in Baja chapter, please. If you haven't, the stuff that we did not cover in class on Thursday, let's say in terms, it's a good chunk of the chapter actually, and it deals mostly with some of the production arrangements that companies like Driscoll's have with producers in the San Quintin Valley in Baja, and it's actually super interesting because it shows how there are, what is known in the literature, of course, this is the term that the author uses, a kind of vertical integration system, right, that goes from the company, right, in the US, Driscoll, that provides these farmers, these small farmers, small producers in Baja, in San Quintin, in this case in particular, with a variety of inputs and supplies and technical knowledge, right, in exchange for the product and of course part of the profits from that product, with a series of important restrictions. This is what is called sort of contract farming, right? Where these companies, a company like Driscoll's, have the control over basically the entire process, right? Despite the fact that Driscoll is not producing directly, right? In a way, this is, on the one hand, a kind of a widespread scheme, right, that everybody knows about it, right? It's subcontracting, essentially, right? And what is interesting in this particular case is that, among other things, companies like Driscoll's actually end up, providing even the water for some of these companies, precisely because Driscoll has the technology and also the money, right, to desalinize some of that underground water that has a high saline content in Baja, right, and that cannot be used directly for certain crops. It'll ruin them. So the local growers, of course, put the land, and in the sort of classic, subcontracting arrangement, of course, these local producers also absorb a lot of the risks that are involved in production, right? Bad weather, typical, right? Classic in the case of agriculture, right? Any sort of, changes in environmental conditions. But also, very critically, it's not exactly here, the management of and recruitment of labor, which is actually very, very important, right? These small producers actually, according to our author here, keep these sort of very lean operations, right? In that they have a small, let's say, permanent staff, and then they hire seasonally, a bunch of, high number of additional workers, right, for harvest and other, processes. So it's actually very interesting because, it's sort of this kind of scheme, right, is, raises sort of this question, right, for these small producers. Is this actually a form of these guys' wage labor, or really sort of an independent family farming, right? When these small producers, these farmers in San Quintin, actually, are very, have to abide by, have to follow these very strict requirements. They have to sell everything to Driscoll. They cannot sell anything independently. They have to, submit to all sorts of conditions in terms of, the standards, requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Again, they depend on Driscoll's for things like, capital, for finance, as well as for things as fundamental and basic as water, right? Because, these small producers don't have the the know-how or the technology or the capital to pay for, these plants that desalinize water in Baja, right? And it's actually very interesting because, when I was, thinking about, some of the main points here. On the one hand, this is kind of classic subcontracting arrangements, right? You subcontract with somebody else for, the in this case, the production of the strawberry, right? The berries, whatever, they're producing there. But on the other hand, it also reminds us of, a lot of people, a lot of, researchers, et cetera, call this sort of a neoliberal, right, arrangement. But in fact, in agriculture, this has been a very old arrangement, right? If you think about it, because can anybody tell me what, if you read and if you read these notes, what does this remind you of in agriculture, in agricultural production in general? If anybody is familiar with how agricultural production works and has worked actually in the U.S. In particular, and not just in the U.S., in many other parts of the world. This looks a lot like sharecropping, right? This looks a lot like sharecropping. This is, classic arrangement where, somebody with sort of either control of the land or control of other vital resources establishes a kind of contract, right, with the person who is going to cultivate the land. In this case, what is, I guess, distinct is that the small farmers actually own the land, right? This is their land, right? This is not the company's land. And it's actually to the benefit of the larger transnational company, right? But there's nonetheless a kind of, yes, subcontracting, but also kind of like classic sharecropping arrangement underneath. And this is actually very interesting because, in fact, if you think about sharecropping as a kind of production scheme, right, in agriculture that has existed in the U.S. or existed in the U.S. for, decades and decades, right? We associate sharecropping with, with the South, with agriculture in the South in the U.S., but it has existed in many other parts of the U.S. It has existed in other parts of the world, as I was saying. What I find actually very interesting about this is that, in fact, it is as if agriculture, right, these sort of social relations of production that have existed in agriculture for a long time everywhere, provide a kind of blueprint for neoliberal arrangements everywhere, and in agriculture, but also besides agriculture. Why? Because a lot of it is, or ends up being, falling. A lot of the risk, right? When we think about, the so-called market, we're really thinking about a lot of fluctuations, a lot of risk, right? I mentioned, just environmental issues, for example, right? Climate change, think about, some kind of, hurricane, which actually happened very recently, right? In Baja and Southern California last year, right? Very unexpectedly, just went through the parts of the peninsula in Southern California and created a lot of destruction. I don't know if you remember that last summer, but it happened, right? I mean, very sort of unusual. But a lot of the risks then associated with that are not covered by the larger transnational company like Driscoll's in this case, and they're not necessarily covered in this case by the Mexican state, right? To the extent that the state has sort of withdrawn from these, spaces of production and does not necessarily provide sort of subsidized insurance to producers, right? The insurance exists, but producers have to really go out to the insurance market and pay for, higher premiums, right? If you want to be protected from these kinds of catastrophes, right? So, anyway, make sure you read that last part of the chapter because it's very important. It's actually quite fundamental to our understanding of sort of these kind of like neoliberal practices, right, in this particular context, which is agriculture, right? Agricultural production in this sort of classic fashion, to the extent that these sort of almost like contract, subcontracting, sharecropping arrangements have existed for a long time. It's actually provides a kind of blueprint for a lot of the neoliberal arrangement, right? It's the market, and the market entails risk, and you deal with the risk, right? So, and it's a little bit about let the stronger and most sort of able producers sort of survive, right? And there's some very interesting stories in that second part of the or last part of the chapter about how a lot of producers, a lot of small farmers in Mexico have actually been driven out of the market precisely because they cannot absorb all these sort of risks and uncertainty and downturns. Think about fluctuations in the price of the product, right? Sometimes there's an oversupply of strawberries. What does oversupply do to products, to goods? Brings prices down, right? That's classic, right? And if you have that beautiful strawberry that we have in Ralph's or Whole Foods or whatever, which entails a certain cost, you might kind of like reroute that strawberry towards the production of jam or marmalade, right? But it's not going to command the same price, right? As if it's going to be something that is going to sit very nicely there in those shelves and then in our sort of name tables and in cereal bowls, right? Anyway, any questions about this stuff? Make sure you read it. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions in the final exam about this stuff. Okay? So, fair warning. No questions? Any questions? Over there? My friends in the back? No? Okay. All right. Today I want to really talk about this stuff, right? This is the week when we're going to be discussing politics, populism, and the transformation of the Mexican political system. We said last class that this is a topic of interest. It's a new topic in this course. I've mentioned in class that this is only the second time I teach this course, so I continue to make changes, and regardless of that, we always make changes, and so we actually, in a couple of weeks, right? In a couple of weeks, there's presidential elections in Mexico, which is very interesting. An added super interesting feature of that is that Mexico is bound to elect its first woman president, right? It's really a race between these two candidates, right? Claudia Sheinbaum, or Sheinbaum, depending on how you like to pronounce it, and Xochitl Gálvez, right? She's the candidate of the governing party, the party of the president currently, and she is the candidate of a coalition of let's say, traditional parties of the Mexican political system, and he's a candidate of a third, newer party that hasn't been around for that long. So these are the leading sort of contenders, right? What is interesting in some way is that this is, I mean, on the one hand, it's sort of a regular presidential election in Mexico. It's important for obvious reasons, right? The new president, right? But it also, it's interesting because the election of the new president is happening in the aftermath of the presidency of Manuel López Obrador, who's the current president. His term ends in October, if I remember correctly. There have been some changes to when the actual tenure ends. But these are the years of his presidency, right? He's been president since 2018. And I'm going to, from now on, because it's Andrés Manuel López Obrador is way too long, I'm going to use the initials, which is, how a lot of people in Mexico and outside Mexico know him, right? AMLO. And so, or some people just use the last names, right? López Obrador. And he became president on his third run for the presidency, right? He ran in 2006, 2012, and he finally won in 2018. And it's interesting to us, for us here in this course, because after several administrations that which were actually on board with the neoliberal agenda, with the Washington Consensus, AMLO actually broke with neoliberalism, right? And he fits the bill for what we in scholars of political sociology identify as a populist leader, right? Populism, right? And we're going to talk more about that populism next class, but I just wanted to do a few things before we do that. So AMLO ran on a kind of anti-corruption and government austerity agenda. And what is interesting is that he, in breaking with neoliberalism, he actually has had to, he has tried to reestablish the role of the state in the Mexican economy to some extent, and he has, but not just in the economy, but in sort of the larger, social and political fabric of Mexico. He has, dedicated a lot of resources to building large infrastructural projects, particularly in the south of Mexico. A big refinery in southeastern Mexico, also a big train railroad project in the Yucatan Peninsula. And he also has put a lot of resources and a lot of political capital, actually, into building, developing, rebuilding the social safety net in Mexico. So he has developed, his government has developed a good number of programs to give direct aid to citizens, let's say. Right? The elderly, unemployed, citizens, etc., etc. Right? So this is actually very interesting, and we'll connect that to sort of populism also, particularly next class. So interestingly enough, he has done all this stuff, and he sort of has a very sort of strong belligerent rhetoric against neoliberalism and what he more generally calls conservatism. The essence of the model of export-oriented industrialization has not changed. Okay? Mexico continues tethered to the larger North American economy, and particularly the U.S. And as we mentioned, I think last class on Zoom, in fact, at the moment, Mexico appears to be benefiting from this sort of phenomenon of nearshoring, right? Relocalization of companies who are kind of like afraid of or fearful, right, of the risk entailed in the geopolitical conflict between the U.S. and China, and they're, moving from China and setting up, establishing, plants, manufacturing facilities in Mexico in order to continue exporting to the U.S. market. Okay. Now, here I obviously had some kind of brain fart, and I did not continue with the rest of the idea. I don't know what I was thinking, but the most important thing here is that you remember that export-oriented industrialization as a general model of the Mexican economy has not really changed, in sort of its fundamentals, right? So AMLO has not really, I think I might remember what I was going to write there. AMLO has not really tried to sort of reverse these changes that have transformed the Mexican economy, trying to go back to the model of import substitution, industrialization, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that he, besides the rhetoric and a few particular moves, he has not as far as sort of economic policy is concerned, he has not antagonized the private sector, especially big capital in Mexico, right? For example, despite calls from people in his party and other people in the sort of leftist or social democratic wing of the political spectrum or side of the political spectrum, he never, and I'm saying never because he's about to finish his term in just a few months, he did not embark on the kind of fiscal reform that is badly needed in Mexico, right? We have talked in class about how the Mexican state, the Mexican government actually struggles with, in terms of taxation, right? There's, for multiple reasons, right? There's a very large informal sector in the economy, right? That it's very difficult to sort of tax, right? And so, that's one of the sort of things that apparently didn't happen, will not happen, right? Fiscal reform, trying to especially tax more of the big companies, right? Transnational companies, big capital, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, the election in 2018, by the way, the election that brought AMLO to power, right, to the presidency, was indeed a kind of cataclysmic event, right? A very, very powerful event. It was a kind of earthquake in the Mexican political system. Partly because there have been several, since, say, 82, right? 82 to 2018, that's a good chunk, right? That's a good number of years. Where multiple administrations have been essentially fully on board with a kind of neoliberal agenda, the Washington Consensus, right? He campaigned against it. He was sort of pretty clear about the fact that he was against neoliberalism. He won, and but he also, the other thing that happened is that he won by a landslide, right? And he really sort of shook the political foundations of the political system and really really sent several of the political parties in Mexico on its way to apparently oblivion, right? Partly because he built his movement, right, and his party, taking from these other parties, right, absorbing political forces, politicians, leaders from getting them to defect, right, essentially from these other, political parties. And so his election, right, his victory in 2018 had, this very, powerful effect on the political system. But the other thing that I wanted to say, which is not really there on that slide, is that in doing so, right, in kind of undermining all these other political parties, weakening their viability, really, to just sort of be around, he's basically at least attempting, if not achieving, the construction of a new hegemonic party in Mexico, a really sort of new dominant party. That's what we mean, or I mean by hegemonic, right? Along the lines of the old PRI, right? Remember the PRI in Mexico, the party that was in power for about 70 years, had that characteristic, and we're going to talk about that next. So I'm going to give you a primer of the Mexican political system in the 20th century, so that a lot of this stuff really makes sense. But again, this is a very important point, right? That sort of hegemonic, almost like a one-party system, right, appeared to have disappeared, right, or with a series of developments in the late 20th century in Mexico, but now is, in a way, reborn, or in some kind of process of re-emerging through the election of López Obrador, AMLO, in Mexico. He calls this the movement, right, that brought him to power, the fourth transformation, or Cuarta Transformación. Why? Because he invokes his movement and his presidency as, or he sort of puts his movement and his presidency as the fourth, or the most recent of, previous transformations in Mexico, right? Independence, right? The period of reform, or reforma, right, in the 1850s, 1860s in Mexico, when the state, reformed the constitution, established a new constitution to separate the church from, running the state, right? And the third transformation being, who can guess? What would be the third transformation?
Revolution.
The revolution, yes, of course, and therefore, his movement being the fourth transformation. Right? Interrupt me if you have any questions, please, or anything that you think I need to explain with more sort of detail. Now, yes, to make sense of these very, very current developments, we have to delve a little bit more into how the political system evolved in Mexico in the 20th century. So the first thing to know is that in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, during the period of revolutionary reconstruction, right, the reconstruction of the state after the revolution, the Mexican political system sort of reconstituted itself as a corporatist party-state system, right? This is a very important term, a very important concept, which I'm going to ask you about in the exam. So pay attention, right? And a key feature of this party-state system is that there's basically no boundary between the party, the political party, right, that is sort of, let's say, competing, right, to running in elections, nominating candidates, etc., and the government and other branches and institutions of the state, right? It's almost like one and the same, right? That's a party-state system. There's no... That, for example, does not exist in the US, right? There is a distinction between the parties and the state apparatus. Yes?
So would it be that the political party's agenda was really connected to the government?
Yeah, yeah. Among many other things, but absolutely. Yes. Now, the other interesting feature of the... so, of course, you know, it basically meant that the party had a control of the state, and the state basically withdrew, you know, its cadres, its platform, whatever, you know, from the party, right? But the other interesting feature is the corporatist aspect of these, right? Now, what is corporatism? It's a classic term in political science, political sociology, right? So, for political purposes, corporatism means or entails, or it's the process by which the state organizes society into bodies or units which have a monopoly in the representation or negotiation of interests or political interests. All of it subordinated to the state, right? So instead of the classic liberal democratic conception of the political system, say, made or being composed of individuals, right? Individuals who vote and, you know, make sort of claims to the state, or also organized, etc., etc. The state actually negotiates and plays actually a key role in organizing society into these sort of bodies, right, that represent collectives or collectivities, right? And I'll explain a little bit more about this. So that was actually the PRI, right? This party that was the hegemonic party of the Mexican political system for most of the 20th century was essentially a corporatist party, right? And so instead of being just, you know, composed or organized by individuals that affiliated with the party, right? I want to be part of this, you know, political party. I sign up some kind of form. I get my card. Da, 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 da. The PRI actually was composed or organized into sectors, okay, that represented organizations represented organizations. The three basic sectors of the PRI were the workers, peasants, and another sector that sort of emerged later, which essentially represented the sort of rising middle classes in Mexico. Early after the revolution, there was a fourth sector, which was the military. But the military actually was kept out of the political game, which was a very interesting feature of the Mexican political system in the 20th century that differentiated the Mexican case from the rest of Latin America. Okay? I actually meant to provide a slide with these, with the logos of the different organizations. But illustrating this kind of, you know, party-state system to begin with, if some of you know this, I know because you're from Mexico, your parents are from Mexico, something like that, or because you have studied this stuff. The logo of the PRI, right, who can describe the logo of the PRI for those who don't know it? Anybody knows? Yes, Natalia.
Is it the flag of Mexico?
The logo of the PRI, of this political party, has the colors of the Mexican flag, right? I mean, this is actually quite telling, right? So, with the initials, right, PRI, right? But it's, it's green, white, and red, right? So there was this kind of symbiosis, right, between the party and the state, right? And then, again, this sort of corporatist element, right, that is very interesting, right? So there were organizations that represented, workers. There were organizations that represented, the sort of the peasantry. There were organizations that represented the kind of like middle class. And again, as I said, at some point, the military were also part of that sort of sectoral corporatist arrangement. Now, some more interesting features of this system that emerged in Mexico in the 20th century. The president, no surprise, right, was the head of this system and the president of the country, but also de facto leader of the party, right? And this system also came to be called presidencialismo, right? Presidentialism, partly because of the incredible power, right, that the president had. It was, I don't want to exaggerate the point because, if I use this term, but it was like almost like an emperor in some respects, right? A very, very powerful figure. The president had the capacity to remove governors. Most of the governors were governors of his political party, but if some kind of issue emerged or happened, the president had the essential, not a legal constitutional power, because Mexico has a federal system, but in reality, it was federal by name only, right? It was really a highly centralized political system, beginning with the fact that the president held concentrated incredible power, right? And all these other branches of government, right? The judiciary and the legislative branch were completely subordinated to the executive, right? That is the president. Okay. Now, going back a little bit to kind of like to the previous slide, right? So the party had this kind of like as a corporatist party, it had this kind of like all-absorbing, all-encompassing power, right? Everybody was, could be potentially included, right? In this sort of corporatist style of government, right? And political organization, right? If you were a worker, you belonged to a union that was affiliated with the PRI. If you were a small farmer or landless peasant in rural Mexico, you could be affiliated with one of the organizations that represented the peasantry. Later on, you could be also like a small business owner in an urban area in Mexico, and you could be affiliated with the organization that kind of like came to represent the urban middle class.
Was there a how do you say it? Like something that represented students in...
Well, there was an organization that there were some student organizations that were affiliated with a large organization that represented these sort of urban middle classes. Yeah. So interesting, but this is a very interesting and important feature of this system is that lots of things could be sort of negotiated, right? Lots of claims could be made to the state fundamentally in terms of, within this sort of party-state system, but at the same time, if you would try to go outside the structure, right, you could actually meet repression, right? You could actually meet punishment, exclusion, etc. So the system was built so that there were a bunch of sort of rewards, right? Including satisfying whatever claims you had, right, or your organization had, so long as it was within the bounds of the system, right? There were some satellite parties, right, opposition parties, but really, for most of the 20th century, elections were not competitive, but did happen. That's the interesting thing, right? The system enjoyed actually great legitimacy, right? Because it, for a good chunk of the 20th century, actually delivered. If not all the goods, at least some goods, right? We talked about these periods of heightened growth, right? In the 50s and 60s, right? Still part of the 70s, although we also talked about how by the 70s that system of import substitution and industrialization was starting to face serious problems, right? There were two golden rules in this political system in the 20th century. First of all, in very, very interesting, some of this is actually very puzzling. I think I mentioned in class how political scientists and political sociologists in the 20th century all over the world, were fascinated with the Mexican case because they couldn't make sense of it. It was very difficult to make sense of the Mexican political system. So it's this system where there's this, kind of like emperor president, right? The party is in power, has been in power for decades. It still holds elections, right? And there is no really sort of competition in those elections, right? What is this creature, right? What is this thing? So, two golden rules that were very important to really give stability to this system. One, no re-election, right? No re-election for any post in Mexico. There's been no re-election in Mexico since after the revolution, right? Whether you're the president or a governor or a mayor or a congressperson, senator, no re-election, right? You have your. Now that doesn't mean that you cannot sort of jump to another post, right? In terms of sort of competing for that, right? But for that particular post, right, and beginning with the presidency, there's no re-election, right? There's no, like in the U.S., you have one chance to get re-elected. In Mexico, it's a 6-year term, and that's it. Okay, very important, and I'll explain why. This whole issue of no re-election is actually a legacy of the Mexican Revolution. There were two important sort of big items on the agenda of the Mexican Revolution, right? Redistribution of land, number one, which translated into an agrarian reform in Mexico, right, based on the provisions of the Constitution, right? That was kind of like the social agenda of the Constitution, right? The kind of like social, say, progressive agenda of the Mexican Revolution. The other item, right? The other point, the other big component was no re-election. Why? Because the armed movement of the revolution had emerged in reaction, in response to this guy who had been getting reelected again and again and again for about 30 years, right? Porfirio Diaz, right? From the 1870s to 1910, right? So no re-election. And it's interesting because no re-election was also tied to let's have real elections, real free competitive elections, right? That is the kind of liberal democratic agenda of the revolution, right? So on the one hand, we have redistribution of land, right? Agrarian reform, etc., the creation of the ejido, we've talked about that. And then on the other hand, we have this sort of, let's have a free electoral system, which, as we can see from what I'm explaining to you, didn't really come to be. Only in its sort of more formal aspects. right? But not, when I say formal, I do not mean that this necessarily was some kind of ruse, that was some kind of deceit. No. This is how the system sort of came to be. And this thing of not giving the president, despite this tremendous power, the chance to get reelected, gave a lot of stability to the political system. Incredible stability. The second golden rule was that the president got to choose his successor with some consultation among political and economic actors in Mexico, right? The powerful, etc., etc. But once that successor was installed as the new president, the former president lost all of his power. That's actually pretty incredible if you think about it. Think about this emperor-like figure who accumulates so much power during his term, right? He can remove governors. He says who's going to be the candidate for this and that, and or at least gives his blessing, right? All sorts of, he has his hands in the judiciary. Congress really does not do any kind of parliamentary work. They really approve initiatives sent by the executive. That's how things work, right? And yet, when it comes to ending his term, right, leaving office, all of that kind of like vanishes. And all of that power, right, all of that incredible capacity and power gets transferred to the new guy. So, the outgoing president essentially as a political figure and as a politician effectively would go into retirement, right? So these characteristics gave actually a great, not just legitimacy, but also legitimacy having to do with kind of like approval, right? But also a great deal of stability. Particularly compared to many other countries around the world, but certainly compared to other countries in Latin America, right? For 70 years, Mexico, this system was in place, right? And compared to Argentina, Brazil, you name it. We can go through the list of countries in Latin America. Mexico had no military coups, right? It was an incredibly stable system, right? Pause for questions. Questions, comments, reactions, wow moments, or anything. Mark.
So if we were to put like AMLO on the political spectrum, what would he be? Would he be like conservative, liberal?
Say the last part again.
If we were to put like AMLO,
right,
the current president, on the political spectrum, where would he be?
The left. Yeah, kind of, but populist left, right? Because there are also all sorts of shades, right? Just like in the entire political spectrum, there's the social democratic left, communist, socialist left, etc., right? So, but we'll get to that for sure in more about populism next class. Any other questions or comments? Is all of this stuff, I've given you a lot today. Is it clear? Are there any questions? It's a lot to process. It's a lot to digest. We're covering almost the entire 20th century here, right? In terms of politics, right? Now, while I've said that political scientists, political sociologists around the world were like fascinated with this very unique animal, with this very unique creature, right? The Mexican political system. What is this? Is it a dictatorship? Well, no, because it's not the same person that is there forever, right? Like in a classic dictatorship, right? And there were plenty of those around the world, right? Especially also in Latin America, right? what is it, right? It's not a liberal democracy because, you have this, party in power forever and ever and ever, right? What is it exactly, right? They say they're revolutionary and that they're like the heirs of a revolution, but at the same time, remember what we said in previous classes, the government was favoring private, the capital and kind of like moving to the center and even to the right on various sort of fronts. Now, despite the fact that I said all of that about this sort of uniqueness of the Mexican political system, not necessarily completely unique, right? The corporatist nature, this sort of corporatist structure that emerged in the period of post-revolutionary reconstruction, roughly 1920 to 1940, actually had its relatives around the world, right? Especially when you kind of like merge corporatism with charismatic populist leaders. Who's this guy? Anybody recognizes this dude? No? Are you sure? No? Nobody? Okay, guys. So next. No, you're not going. Many of you are not going to be around next quarter. So. But maybe I'll teach a course on world politics in the fall. This is Benito Mussolini, right? The leader of fascist Italy, right? In the 1920s, 1930s, right? Who also was, this populist, charismatic leader who set to organize Italian society in a kind of corporatist fashion as well, right? So, and who's this guy? That's even less of a chance that you're going to know who this guy is. This guy's my uncle. No, no, it's not true. Anybody? No? It's harder, right? It's like asking you who scored in the World Cup of 1970, which I almost did, but I didn't. This is Juan Domingo Perón, the leader of a movement, a very powerful movement, that has shaped Argentinian politics in the 20th century, right? He was the president of Argentina for multiple periods, right? Actually until his death in about 1974, I want to say, something like that. And another charismatic leader, right, who also set out to launch a kind of sort of corporatist system, right, in Argentina, beginning in the 40s, 50s, and so on, right? So it's interesting because there is a connection between this sort of populist leadership and these sort of corporatist political structures, right? And now you guys know this guy, right? Cárdenas, right? This is Lázaro Cárdenas, the president of Mexico, 1934 to 1940. And Cárdenas, this is the guy who we've talked about this guy before. He's the guy who, he's the president, not the guy. The president who nationalized the oil industry, right? The kind of, hero in a way in Mexico in many respects, right? A very also very charismatic figure. And Cárdenas is credited with kind of sort of planting the basis for the corporatist system of the PRI, right? Together with, it's just not him, but, a bunch of sort of politicians and organic intellectuals came up with this idea of, having this party organized into sectors, right? The workers sector, the peasant sector, the kind of like middle class sector, right? During Cárdenas' tenure, the military was constituted a sector of the party, right? Later on, the military were like removed So they would not have sort of an active role in politics in Mexico, right? One thing that I didn't mention in connection with the previous slides is that another, I kind of get a kick out of it. You know, I talked about these sort of golden rules. Mexico has no vice president. And I always think that was one of the smartest things to do in terms of giving stability to the system. Because in Mexico's history and the history of many other countries, particularly in Latin America, the vice presidents are always conspiring to take over the presidency. So they can't wait, and they just are like conspiring with the military and like organizing coups against the president. So very smart too. Don't have a vice president. What? You know, they're just like gathering dust somewhere in a corner, right? So collecting dust. Any questions about, you know, our friends here? You know, think about this. Politically very different. Politically very different, right? I'm kind of like bringing them here in like one slide, right? But this was a fascist, right? Mussolini was a fascist, sort of right-wing, you know, associated with, you know, eventually allied with Hitler, right, in World War II. Perón was this very funky figure that inspired this thing that is still alive in Argentina, Peronismo, right? There is still a Peronist party in Argentina, and there's left-wing Peronismo, and there's right-wing Peronismo, right? And then, of course, you have Cárdenas, which you associate with kind of like the program, the agenda of the Mexican Revolution, right? Nationalism, autonomy, independence, all this stuff that we've talked about at length, right? Very different ideological orientations, but all of these guys, all of these sort of leaders, political figures, right, were on board with this sort of corporatist style of politics, right? And yeah, so any questions? So if there are no questions, I'm just going to move. All right? Moving. Now, the Mexican political system begins to change in the 1970s. It wasn't that static, right? I'm painting a picture of great stability, et cetera, but stability doesn't mean that the system was completely static, right? A very important thing happened in the late 1970s, which was the introduction of proportional representation for political parties in the lower chamber of Congress in Mexico, right? Of course, we've talked at length in class about the 1980s lost decade, right? The crisis of import substitutional industrialization, the structural adjustment program sort of imposed with the IMF, right? And that, of course, had a series of very serious effects, you know, eroded the economic and political legitimacy of the government, right, of the regime, right? So there, you can think of these as kind of external shocks, right? External shocks, not entirely external, right? Always the difference between external and internal is a little bit arbitrary, or very arbitrary. And then in 1988, not an external shock, but an internal shock happened, which is, or was, that there was an internal split of the PRI, right? So imagine how significant this was. I was in college back then. And it really shook the country and the political system, right? Because the nationalist wing of the PRI, led by none other than the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, which we will see momentarily in a picture, right? Expressed openly, publicly, which you were not supposed to do, its disagreement with the president, right? The name of that president is not there. But basically, it's disagreement with the kind of neoliberal direction of the country, right? By 1988, it was clear that Mexico was going in the direction of the kind of like neoliberal agenda, right? Again, partly imposed by the IMF, but also it had its domestic constituents, right? We also talked in class already about how the economists were kind of gaining ground in terms of the leadership in the party and in the government, right? This was a kind of technocratic takeover, right? And that neoliberal wing was represented by Carlos Salinas de Gortari. You'll remember is the guy who signed NAFTA, right? I showed you that picture. I can show it again, right? That's that picture where Salinas and what's his name, George Bush Sr. and Brian Mulroney of Canada were, posing for with their trade negotiators signing the document. Right? I showed you that picture. So this was unheard of. This kind of public internal split. There were probably discrepancies and debates and all sorts of things throughout the decades, but nothing like the open sort of quarrel, the open split, right? And what happened is that Cárdenas and the members of this sort of nationalist wing of the PRI eventually left the party, right? And Cárdenas competed against Salinas for the presidency in 1988. This was the most competitive election the PRI faced since its founding. And there were actually, Cárdenas officially got about a third of the vote, which was unheard of for an opposition candidate, right? Imagine how that also translated into representation in Congress, right? But there were actually very serious accusations of electoral fraud. Right? Cárdenas, just like AMLO, by the way, ran for the presidency multiple times, actually 3 times, but never won. He also ran to become mayor of Mexico City and became mayor of Mexico City in 1997, right? There are a series of things that happened around that, but this was actually very important because Mexico City did not have, until a political reform that happened in the 1990s, the mayor of Mexico City was not elected by the citizens of Mexico City. He was actually appointed by the president. And it had, the position actually had this name that sort of harkened back to colonial times. It was not called a mayor or a governor, it was called a regente, a regent, right? Like somebody who's appointed by, almost like the viceroy or the king, right, to govern a particular place, right? It's very, very crazy if you think about it, right? So Cárdenas, Cárdenas Jr., let's say, becomes the mayor of Mexico City, and of course, many of you have heard how in 2000, finally, the PRI loses the presidency, right? And Vicente Fox becomes president. Interesting, of course, Cárdenas Jr., right? Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, not the same name of the father, but really led this sort of very powerful crisis of the political system in 1988. Again, in 1997, he becomes mayor of Mexico City. And Fox, right, becomes president, as I said, in 2000. But while he represented a kind of leftist nationalist agenda, Fox actually was on board with the neoliberal program, right? So from that point of view, of course, he did not change course into what was already unfolding in Mexico in terms of economic policy and so on, right? So think about this period starting with, say, 1988, if you will, or if you will, the 1990s onward, as a period of liberalization of the Mexican political system, right? That allowed for competitive elections, right? finally an opposition candidate winning the presidency, right? An opposition candidate winning Mexico City, right? Becoming the mayor of Mexico City. A very important feature, you cannot quite read here, right? No. A very important feature of this liberalization of the political system was the creation of an independent electoral authority or body that actually organizes the elections, right? The organization of the elections in Mexico was in the hands of the government, right? Basically the Ministry of Interior. And started with a political reform that took place around 1996. Mexico creates an independent entity, right? Was called Instituto Federal Electoral, or Federal Electoral Institute, right? And it also creates a sort of adjacent body or adjacent institution, a tribunal that adjudicates the elections. That's also no longer in the hands of the government. Very, very, very important reform. So this is a picture of Cárdenas, probably 88, in the Zócalo, right, in the main square in Mexico City where the National Palace is, right? And he held a series of rallies and assemblies and everything, filling the Zócalo to capacity. As people like to say here, the optics of this was amazing. Incredible, right? Because it was the opposition, right, challenging the government and the president in the most symbolic and powerful, as far as symbolism is concerned, space in the country, right? The main square in Mexico City, right in front of the National Palace. When I see this picture, of course, I think, ¿dónde está Waldo? Right here. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, breaking the seriousness of the moment. Guys, questions. I want questions. You don't ask questions. I feel lonely here. Questions, reactions. Want to get? Come on. Yes.
Can we just clarify then what it's that made the political party to stop being the one that has been winning over the years?
Yeah, of course. Let's go back one slide. Right. Yeah, of course. Of course, I'm simplifying part of the story because you can think about the 1968 repression, right, as being a big sort of jolt of the system, right? Because, the government repressed that student movement. A lot of people got killed and injured. Then this was also followed by people. Some of these students actually said, you know what, we cannot make claims. The government is not listening to us, and we're going to go the route of radicalism, right? And some of them joined guerrilla movements, right? Rural and urban guerrilla movements in Mexico, right? So 1968 already becomes a big sort of jolt of the system. And actually these, Natalia and everybody else, this 1977 reform that introduced proportional representation, that is, if a party wins a certain percentage of the vote, the party is allowed certain numbers of seats in Congress. That's what it means, right? In case you don't know what that means. That's proportional representation, right? Why would the PRI, with all its stability and legitimacy, brand that? Why? Well, because there was already a kind of erosion, right, of that legitimacy, beginning with the state having to resort to more repressive means to calm things down in certain parts of the country with students, with peasants. There was guerrilla. I talked briefly about that kind of like dirty war that also happened in Mexico in the mid-1970s, with the army going into villages in southern Mexico, villages that were suspected of aiding guerrilla movements and then wiping everybody, killing everybody, right, in those villages, et cetera, et cetera. So those reforms, right, in 1977 were a response to these kinds of developments, right? And of course, right, the very profound economic crisis of the 1980s. Remember, Mexico had enjoyed economic stability and growth for decades, right, after World War II. Remember the Mexican miracle, right? The other, this is a term that we have not used in class that much, but I thought about this weekend. The other term that was used to refer to the Mexican miracle was desarrollo estabilizador, stabilizing development, which is quite telling as a term for sort of, kind of like economic policy and economic program and, let's say, an economic reality, right? Stabilizing development. Development that does not create sort of big disruptions, but that has this sort of powerful to stabilize like sort of economy and society, right, and the political system. But then that just comes to a halt in the 1980s, right? Devaluations, no increases in the minimum wage, all sorts of things, that are happening. The government having to resort to more and more loans from the IMF, and the having to service its debt, right? A lot of the money that the government was sort of making, right, through taxation, went right into paying for these loans, a huge percentage of that money. So that means money that cannot be allocated to education, to health, to all these other needs, right? Building new infrastructure projects and so forth and so on. A lot of part of the Washington Consensus neoliberal agenda was lean state, which meant that a lot of the bureaucracy, right? The state is a big creator of jobs, of employment in Mexico and everywhere around the world, for pretty much. But if you go on board like Mexico did with this Washington Consensus / neoliberal agenda, you will have to fire a lot of people in the bureaucracy, a lot of people who work, in government agencies, right, to reduce your deficit, all these things that were, right, prescribed. And so it's not by accident, right, that this powerful contestation within the PRI took place in 1988 in the context of years and years of economic crisis in Mexico in the 1980s, and also a kind of juncture where there's of course a kind of historic nationalist wing of the PRI who's what happened to import substitution and industrialization? What happened to autonomy? What happened to our nationalist agenda, creating the basis, the internal domestic basis for development? You guys, neoliberals, led by Salinas, are on board with this privatization, blah, 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 leave it to the market, reduce the size of the state, eliminate subsidies, et cetera, right? So that, all of these sort of developments, right, led to that. You guys have 1 minute for questions. All right, if no questions, I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you, guys.